she refused to touch any man. Not their hands when they offered help, not their shoulders when they stumbled past her on the trading paths, not even to push them away when they came too close. For years, the people who crossed through the high desert territories whispered about the Apache woman who lived like a ghost among the red rocks. They said she had made a vow. They said she would rather watch a man burn than lay a finger on him to put out the flames. But what they didn't know was that every vow has a breaking point, and Callum Ridge was about to become hers. The sun stood directly overhead when Nakoma first saw him stumbling between the sage clusters. She had been tracking a wounded deer since dawn, moving silently through the scattered brush and sun-bleached stones that marked the boundary of what she considered her land. The deer had vanished into a narrow wash, but something else caught her attention. Movement that wasn't right. A man swaying on his feet like a dead tree in wind about to fall. She stopped behind an outcropping of red rock and watched him. He wore the clothes of a rancher, a hat that had seen too many seasons, and he carried nothing but a near-empty canteen that swung loosely from his belt. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His shirt was soaked through with sweat that had long since stopped cooling him. She could see the tremor in his legs from 50 feet away. Nakoma's jaw tightened. She knew what was happening to him. The heat out here didn't ask permission. It took what it wanted, and right now it wanted this man's life. He had maybe an hour before his body gave up completely, maybe less. She should turn away. She had done it before. 3 times in the past several years, she had watched men collapse on the edges of her territory, and she had walked in the opposite direction. Her vow was absolute. No contact, no exceptions. The moment she allowed herself to touch another human being, especially a man, the protection she had built around herself would crack, and she couldn't afford cracks. But this man kept moving. He didn't sit down and wait for help like the others had. He kept pushing forward, one boot in front of the other, even as his body screamed at him to stop. There was something in that stubbornness that made her pause, something that reminded her of herself. He took another step. Then his legs folded beneath him. The sound of his body hitting the hard ground echoed across the empty space between them. He didn't get up, didn't move at all except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Nakoma stood frozen. Every instinct she had cultivated over the years told her to leave, walk away, let the desert make its own decisions about who lived and who didn't. But her feet wouldn't move. She stared at his motionless form, and for the first time in years, the absolute certainty of her vow wavered. She thought of her mother's face, her sister's screams, the rough hands that had destroyed everything she had been before that day. The vow had saved her. It had given her control when everything else had been taken. But watching this man die would be a different kind of wound, one that would leave a scar just as deep. Her hands began to shake, not from fear, from the weight of the choice pressing down on her with the same merciless force as the sun overhead. She could walk away and remain untouched, unbroken, safe, or she could go to him and shatter every wall she had spent years building. The man's chest barely moved now. Minutes, not hours. That's all he had left. Nakoma closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. When she opened them again, she was already moving toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. And with every step closer, she could feel the vow she had made crumbling beneath her feet like sun-dried clay. Her hands hovered above his shoulder for 3 full breaths before she finally touched him. The contact sent a shock through her system that had nothing to do with temperature. His shirt was soaked through, burning hot from sun and fever. Underneath the fabric, she could feel the ridge of his collarbone, the shallow movement of breath that was barely there. The moment her skin met his, every muscle in her body locked. Her throat closed. For a few seconds, she couldn't breathe at all. This was the thing she had sworn never to do again. The barrier she had built between herself and the world of men. And now it was gone, shattered by necessity, and a choice she would have to live with for the rest of her life. But there was no time for the panic clawing at her chest. The man was dying. Nakoma forced her hands to move. She checked his pulse at his neck, felt the rapid, thready beat that told her his body was already starting to fail. His skin had gone past red, into a grayish pallor, that meant the heat had won. She grabbed his canteen, shook it, empty except for a few drops that had evaporated into nothing. She looked around at the empty landscape stretching in every direction. Her shelter was 2 miles north, tucked into a canyon where a spring ran year-round. 2 miles through sand and stone and heat that would finish him before they made it halfway. But staying here meant watching him die in the next 20 minutes. There was only one option. She would have to carry him. Nakoma had carried deer carcasses across her shoulders. She had hauled water containers that weighed more than most men. But this was different. This required touching him completely, holding him against her body in a way that made every nerve in her system scream in protest. She crouched beside him, worked her arms beneath his shoulders and knees, and lifted. His weight settled across her arms, his head falling against her chest. She stood slowly, adjusting to the burden, and started walking north. Each step sent dust rising around her boots. Each step took her further from the person she had been an hour ago. His breath was hot against her collarbone. She could feel his heartbeat, weak and irregular, through the layers of fabric between them. The sensation made her want to drop him and run. But she kept moving, one foot after another, her legs burning with effort, and her mind screaming at her to let go. Halfway to the canyon, his eyes opened. Just barely, unfocused and glazed with fever. He tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His hand lifted weakly, as if trying to push away from her. But the strength wasn't there. The hand fell back against his chest. Nakoma looked down at him, this stranger in her arms who had no idea what his collapse had cost her. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the color of stone after rain, and there was something in them, even through the delirium that looked like recognition, as if some part of him understood what she was doing, what she was giving up. Then his eyes closed again, and his head fell heavier against her. She tightened her grip and walked faster. The canyon opening appeared in the distance, a dark slash in the red rock face. Water, shade, a chance to save him, and then figure out what came next. But as she crossed into the shadow of the canyon walls, one thought kept circling through her mind like a vulture. She had broken her vow. The protection was gone, and she had no idea what that meant for the fragile peace she had built in this isolated corner of the world. The only thing she knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. Her shelter sat at the back of the canyon where the rock walls curved inward like cupped hands. A single room built from stone and timber, barely large enough for one person. A place she had chosen specifically because no one would want to share it. Now she was carrying an unconscious man through the doorway. Nakoma laid him on the floor near the back wall where the stone stayed coolest. His body was still radiating heat like metal left in the sun. She grabbed a clay bowl and filled it from the water barrel in the corner, then knelt beside him and began the work of bringing his temperature down. The wet cloth moved across his forehead, his neck, the pulse points at his wrists. Each touch felt like a betrayal of everything she had built, but she forced herself to keep going. Water down his throat, a few drops at a time, cool compresses on his chest. His breathing was shallow but steady. That was something. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. His face was weathered in a way that spoke of years under open sky. Lines around his eyes that came from squinting into distances. A scar along his jawline that had healed poorly. His hands were calloused and cracked, the hands of someone who worked until his body gave out and then kept working anyway. Those hands reminded her of her father's hands. Before. Nakoma stood quickly and moved to the other side of the room. She couldn't think about that. Not now. Not with a stranger occupying the space she had kept sacred for years. Hours passed. The light coming through the doorway shifted from harsh white to softer gold. She changed the water, replaced the compresses, gave him more to drink when his throat would accept it. His fever began to break just after sunset. The gray pallor faded from his skin. His breathing deepened. She was replacing the cloth on his forehead when his hand shot up and caught her wrist. The contact froze them both. His grip was weak but deliberate. His eyes opened, clearer now but still confused. He stared at her face, then at his own hand wrapped around her wrist, then back at her face. Where? His voice was barely a rasp. Nakoma tried to pull away, but his fingers tightened. Not painfully, just enough to keep her there. Every instinct screamed at her to wrench free, to put distance between them, but something in his expression stopped her. He wasn't trying to hold her down. He was trying to hold on. Like a man drowning who had just found something solid. "You're safe," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth. She hadn't spoken to another person in months. "You collapsed." Heat exhaustion. He blinked slowly, processing. His eyes moved around the small room, taking in the stone walls, the water barrel, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Then back to her. "You carried me?" She nodded once. Something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe. Or disbelief. His grip on her wrist loosened, but he didn't let go completely. "I felt it," he said quietly. "Being carried. Thought I was dreaming. You weren't. Why?" The question came out raw. "I've heard stories about you. The woman who won't touch anyone. They said you'd rather watch a man die than—" "I know what they say." His eyes searched her face, looking for an answer she didn't have, or didn't want to give. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of water dripping from the cloth into the bowl. Finally, he released her wrist. She pulled back immediately, cradling her arm against her body as if he had burned her. In a way, he had. The shape of his fingers still pressed into her skin like a brand. "Thank you," he said. She turned away and walked to the doorway, needing air, needing space. The canyon was filling with purple shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called into the gathering dark. Behind her, she heard him try to sit up and fail, heard the harsh intake of breath that meant his body was reminding him how close he had come to dying. "Don't move," she said without turning around. "You need rest." "How long do I stay?" The question hung in the air like smoke. She didn't have an answer. Couldn't think past the next hour, the next moment. All she knew was that he was here now, in her space, and everything she had worked so hard to control was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Until you're strong enough to leave," she finally said. But even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if that was the truth, or if some part of her already knew that when he left, he would take something with him that she could never get back. He stayed on the floor through the night. She stayed awake in the corner, watching him breathe, making sure the fever didn't return. Every time he shifted in his sleep, she tensed. Every sound he made reminded her that she was no longer alone. By morning, he could sit up without his head spinning. She brought him water and a piece of dried meat that he chewed slowly, his jaw working like it took all his concentration. She stayed near the doorway, as far from him as the small room would allow. "Callum," he said between bites. "My name." She didn't offer hers in return. Names created connections. Connections created complications. "What were you doing out there?" she asked instead. "No supplies, no horse, just walking until you dropped." He swallowed, looked down at his hands. "Lost my land 3 weeks ago. Speculators came through with paperwork that said I never had legal claim to begin with. Paid off the right people, I guess, took everything. So you decided to walk across the desert. Had a horse. She went lame 2 days ago. I left her with a trader heading the other direction." He paused. "I was trying to reach the settlement past the southern ridge. Heard they needed workers. That's 40 miles from here. You wouldn't have made it another 5. I know that now." Nakoma studied him. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a flat acceptance of facts. She recognized that tone. She used it herself when thinking about things that couldn't be changed. "The speculators," she said. "They have a name?" Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or fear. "Call themselves the Territorial Development Company. 3 men. The one in charge has a scar here." He traced a line down his left cheek. "They're buying up every piece of land they can get their hands on, legal or not." Her stomach tightened. She knew those men. Not their faces, but their type. The kind who took what they wanted and left destruction behind them. The kind who had ridden through her village when she was 17 and turned her entire world into smoke and screaming. "They're expanding west," Callum continued. "Heard them talking about it. Rich clients back east want territory. Want it empty." He looked up at her. "You should know. If they find out you're living here, I know how to stay hidden. You were hidden, but you saved me. Now I know where you are." He shifted, wincing at the movement. "And if I found you, they can too." The words settled into the room like stones dropping into still water. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but he wasn't. She had broken her isolation for him, and that single choice had consequences that rippled outward like cracks in ice. "How long before you can travel?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days then. I'll give you supplies, water, enough to reach the settlement." He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on her face. "The stories they tell about you, are they true?" "Which stories?" "That you made a vow. That something happened." He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. "That you won't let anyone close." Nakoma's jaw tightened. "Until yesterday, they were true. What changed?" She didn't answer. Couldn't explain that watching him die would have broken something different inside her. That the choice between 2 kinds of pain had been no choice at all. Instead, she turned toward the doorway. "You need to rest, build your strength. Wait. The word stopped her. She looked back. Why did you save me? He asked. Really? The question hung between them, demanding honesty she didn't want to give. She thought about all the men she had watched collapse over the years, all the times she had chosen her vow over their lives. What made him different? Was it the stubborn way he kept moving even when his body was failing? Was it something in his face that reminded her of people she had lost? Or was it simply that after years of isolation, some part of her was tired of being alone? I don't know, she finally said. And that was the truth that scared her most. She stepped outside into the morning air. The canyon was quiet except for the sound of water moving over stone somewhere deeper in the rocks. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. 2 days. Then he would leave and she could rebuild her walls, reinforce the barriers, go back to the life she had chosen. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie. Some things, once broken, couldn't be put back together the same way. And the moment she had lifted him into her arms, she had shattered something that no amount of solitude could repair. Behind her, through the doorway, she heard him settle back down, heard the change in his breathing as he drifted toward sleep. And for the first time in years, Nakoma realized she was afraid, not of him, but of what would happen when he was gone, and she had to face the silence again. The 2 days passed differently than she expected. Callum didn't push, didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. He simply existed in her space with a quiet respect that made it harder to resent his presence. On the morning of the second day, she found him outside at the spring washing his shirt in the cold water. His back was to her, bare skin marked with old scars that told their own stories. She should have turned away, should have given him privacy, but something kept her standing there, watching the way water ran down his spine, the careful way he moved as if his body still hurt. He must have sensed her because he looked over his shoulder. Their eyes met. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then he reached for his shirt and pulled it on, wet fabric clinging to his frame. Didn't mean to intrude, he said. It's fine. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. The way her heart had jumped when she saw him. The way she found herself listening for his footsteps. The way the silence felt different now. Less like peace, and more like waiting. That afternoon, they sat on opposite sides of the doorway while the heat pressed down on the canyon. He was mending a tear in his boot with a strip of leather she had given him. She was sorting through dried herbs, separating the useful from the spoiled. You live out here alone, he said. Not a question. A statement that invited explanation. Yes. No family, no tribe. Her hands stilled. Not anymore. He nodded, didn't push further, but after a moment he spoke again. The scar on your shoulder. I saw it when I was helping you lift the water barrel earlier. That's not from an accident. She had forgotten about him helping with the barrel, had forgotten to maintain her careful distance because the task required 2 people, and she had stopped thinking of him as a threat. Another crack in her armor. No, she said quietly. Not an accident. The men who did it. Are they the reason for your vow? Every muscle in her body tensed. She wanted to shut the conversation down, wanted to retreat into the cold silence that had protected her for years. But something about the way he asked, gentle and without judgment, made the words come anyway. They came to our village, said they had rights to the land, papers from the territorial office. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the only way she could tell it. My father argued, said we had been there for generations, said their papers meant nothing. She paused, staring at the herbs in her hands without seeing them. They made an example, burned the lodges. My father tried to fight. They killed him first. Then my uncle, my brother. Her throat tightened, but she pushed through. My mother and sister, it took them longer to die. They made sure we watched. Callum's hands had stopped moving. He sat perfectly still, listening. I was 17. Strong, even then. They grabbed me, held me down. Their hands. She stopped, swallowed. But one of the younger ones, he had some mercy left. Or maybe he was just a coward. When the others were distracted, he let me go, told me to run. And you did. I ran until I couldn't feel their hands anymore, until I was so far into the desert that I couldn't hear the screams. She looked up at him. I made the vow that night. Never again. No man would touch me. No man would have that power over me. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Callum set down his boot and the leather strip. His eyes were steady on her face. The company that took my land. he said slowly. "The leader with the scar. His name is Rourke, and the other 2 men with him. They work the same way. Find land they want. Forge papers, remove anyone who argues." Her stomach dropped. "When was this?" 3 weeks ago for me. But they've been operating for years. Moving west, clearing territory." He paused. One of them had an Apache necklace hanging from his saddle, fresh enough that the beads still had color. The herbs fell from her hands. She stood abruptly, walked to the edge of the canyon, needed air that didn't feel like it was choking her. Callum followed but stopped several feet away, giving her space. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. They're still doing it." Her voice shook. "After all these years. Still destroying families, still taking everything." "Yes." She turned to face him. "You said they're moving west. Last I heard they were mapping the territories north of here, looking for isolated settlements, easy targets." His expression darkened. "Places like this canyon." The words hung between them like a blade. She had stayed hidden for so long, had convinced herself that isolation meant safety. But Callum was right. If they were expanding west, it was only a matter of time before they found her. "When do you leave?" she asked. "Dawn tomorrow." "Like we agreed." She nodded. Tomorrow he would walk away, and she would be alone again. Alone when the men who destroyed her family came looking for new territory to claim. The thought of facing them alone didn't scare her. She had survived worse. But the thought of Callum leaving, of losing the only person in years who had looked at her scars and seen something other than damage, that scared her in a way she didn't know how to name. They heard the horses just after sunset. Nakoma was at the spring refilling water containers when the sound of hooves on stone echoed through the canyon. 3 riders, moving slow and deliberate, not lost travelers, not passing through. They were searching. She dropped the containers and ran back to the shelter. Callum was already on his feet, his face tight with recognition. "It's them," he said. "You're sure?" "I know the sound of Rourke's horse. Big roan with a shoe that clicks wrong on the right front." He moved to the doorway, staying back in the shadows. "They must have tracked me." Nakoma's mind raced. The canyon had only one entrance. If the riders came in, there was no way out except past them. She had lived here for years without being found because she was careful, because she left no trace. But Callum's path through the desert had been visible. His collapse had left marks. And now those marks had led 3 killers directly to her door. "Stay inside," she said. "What are you going to do?" "What I've done before. Disappear into the rocks until they leave." "They won't leave. Not if they think someone's living here." Callum's jaw tightened. "And if they find evidence of 2 people, they'll know I'm alive. They'll search until they find us both." He was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. But standing and fighting meant breaking the careful isolation that had kept her safe. It meant being seen, being known. The horses were closer now. She could hear voices, low and rough. One of them laughed at something, and the sound sent ice through her veins. She knew that laugh, had heard it before, years ago, while her world burned. "The back wall," Callum said quietly. "There's a gap in the stones. I saw it this morning, big enough for 1 person. I know about it. It leads to a dead end. Then you hide there. I'll tell them I'm alone, that I stumbled in here yesterday." She looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "They'll recognize you. They'll know you survived. Maybe. But they're looking for land, not me specifically. If I'm alone and half dead, I'm not worth their time." His eyes were steady, determined. "You, though, if they find you, if they realize an Apache woman has been living on unclaimed territory." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The horses stopped outside. She heard saddles creaking as the men dismounted. Heard boots hitting ground. Heard the unmistakable sound of someone checking their weapon. "Go," Callum said. "Now." Every instinct told her to refuse. She didn't hide. She didn't run. Not anymore. But the look on his face stopped her. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was trying to save her. And in that moment, she realized something that made her chest tighten. She cared whether he lived or died, more than she had cared about anything in years. Nakoma grabbed the water containers and moved quickly to the back wall. The gap between stones was narrow but passable. She squeezed through into the small space beyond, barely wide enough to turn around. Through the gap, she could see Callum moving around the shelter, arranging things to look like a single person had been staying there. "Hello in there," a voice called from outside, rough and confident. "We're looking for someone. Young fellow, Might have passed this way recently. Callum walked to the doorway, moving with a deliberate weakness that made him look like he was barely standing. Just me here. Been recovering from heat sickness. That so? The voice came closer. Mind if we take a look around? It's not much to see. We'll be the judge of that. 3 men stepped through the doorway. The first one was tall and broad, with a scar running down his left cheek exactly where Callum had described. Rourke, the man who had taken everything from both of them. Behind him came 2 others. Younger, but no less dangerous. One of them carried a rifle loosely, finger near the trigger. Rourke looked around the small shelter, his eyes taking in every detail. The single bedroll, the supplies stacked against one wall, the water barrel in the corner. You alone out here? He asked. Yes. Long way from anywhere to be alone. Rourke moved closer to Callum, studying his face. Don't I know you? Callum met his gaze without flinching. Don't think so. Ridge. That's your name, isn't it? The rancher from the eastern section. Thought you'd moved on after we acquired your property. I did move on. Got sick halfway to the settlement. Found this place empty. Rourke smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. Funny thing, we've been mapping this area for future development. This canyon isn't on any of our charts. But now here you are, squatting on unclaimed territory. He turned to one of his men. Check the back. Make sure he's telling the truth about being alone. Through the gap, Nakoma watched the younger man walk toward the back wall. Her hand moved slowly to the knife at her belt. If he found the gap, if he looked through, she would have no choice but to fight. And if she fought, Callum would try to help her, and they would both die. The man's boots stopped inches from the gap. She held her breath, pressed herself against the cold stone, made herself as small as possible. Nothing back here, the man called. Just rock. Rourke nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on Callum. You look familiar. Real familiar. Like maybe I've seen you somewhere recently. I've got one of those faces. Maybe. Rourke walked a slow circle around Callum. Or maybe you're the fellow who walked away from our business transaction without settling his affairs properly. The fellow who might have some hard feelings about how things worked out. The shelter went silent, except for the sound of Rourke's boots on the stone floor. Nakoma's fingers tightened on her knife handle. One wrong word, and this would turn violent fast. Callum held Rourke's gaze without flinching. I settled everything. You took my land. I left. That was the deal. Was it? Rourke's smile widened. Because the way I remember it, you made some threats before you walked away. Said some things about bringing authorities down on our operation. I was angry. People say things when they're angry. That they do. Rourke nodded to the man with the rifle. Check his supplies. See if there's anything that doesn't belong to a man traveling alone. The younger man started going through the packs near the wall. Nakoma watched through the gap, her heart hammering. She had been careful to move her things, but what if she had missed something? One item that looked like it belonged to a woman and everything would collapse. The man held up a second bedroll. Boss, there's 2 of these. Rourke's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. 2 bedrolls, but you're alone. Found both when I got here, Callum said evenly. Whoever lived here before left in a hurry. Or they're still here. Rourke walked slowly around the shelter again, studying every shadow, every corner. His boots stopped inches from where Nakoma crouched behind the wall. You know what I think, Ridge? I think you're lying. I think you found yourself a hideout, and maybe even some company. And I think we need to have a longer conversation about your intentions. He grabbed Callum by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the wall. The impact echoed through the small space. Callum's head cracked against stone, but he didn't cry out. Where's your friend? Rourke demanded. Who else is here? Nobody. Rourke hit him. Not with rage, but with calculated precision. The kind of violence meant to extract information without killing too quickly. Callum's head snapped to the side. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Wrong answer. Through the gap, Nakoma's fingers tightened on her knife. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden. To let this play out. Callum was trying to protect her. If she revealed herself now, his sacrifice meant nothing. But watching them hurt him was tearing something apart inside her chest. Rourke hit him again. This time Callum's knees buckled, but Rourke held him up, kept him pinned against the wall. Last chance. Who else is here? Apache? Settler? Someone who might cause us problems down the line? Callum spit blood onto the floor. Go to. The third blow cut off his words. His body went limp in Rourke's grip. Stubborn fool. Rourke let him drop to the ground. He turned to his men. Burn it. The shelter, the supplies, everything. If there's someone else here, the smoke will flush them out. If not, at least we've eliminated a potential problem. One of the men pulled out a piece of flint and steel, started gathering the dried herbs from the shelf. The bedrolls, anything that would catch fire easily. Nakoma watched them stack the tinder near the doorway, watched them prepare to destroy the only home she had known in years. But more than that, she watched Callum lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his face. She had broken her vow to save his life, had carried him when he collapsed, had let him into her space, her silence, her carefully constructed world. And now, he was willing to die to keep her hidden. The decision crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She could stay hidden and let him burn, could watch from her gap in the stones while they destroyed everything, could survive alone like she had always done, or she could step out and fight beside him. Her hand moved to the gap. Through the narrow opening, she could see the man with the flint starting to strike sparks, could see Rourke watching the doorway, waiting for flames, could see Callum beginning to stir, trying to push himself up. Nakoma took a breath, let it out slowly. Then she squeezed through the gap and stepped into the open. All three men froze. Their eyes went wide as they took in her height, her traditional dress, the knife in her hand. Rourke's expression shifted from surprise to something darker. Recognition, maybe. Or anticipation. "Well," he said slowly, "what do we have here?" Nakoma moved to stand between them and Callum. "You need to leave. Now." Rourke laughed. "Apache woman living on unclaimed territory. That's interesting. Real interesting." His eyes moved over her, calculating. "You know, we've been clearing these lands for a reason. Can't have natives squatting on valuable property. Bad for business. This isn't your land. It is now." He nodded to his men. "Take her, and make sure Ridge watches before we finish him. Let him see what happens when people interfere with progress." The two younger men moved toward her. Nakoma shifted her weight, knife ready. She had survived worse odds, had fought her way through situations that should have killed her. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. Callum pushed himself up from the floor, blood dripping from his face. He grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack and swung it hard into the back of the nearest man's knees. The man went down with a shout. The second man turned, distracted. Nakoma moved fast, drove her shoulder into his chest, and sent him stumbling backward into the wall. The knife flashed, not to kill, just to wound, just to create space. Rourke pulled his weapon, but Callum was already moving, still weak but desperate. They collided and went down in a tangle of limbs. The weapon skittered across the floor. Nakoma dove for it. Her fingers closed around cold metal just as Rourke broke free from Callum and lunged at her. She rolled, came up with the weapon pointed at his chest. "Stop." Her voice cut through the chaos. Everyone froze. The two younger men were on the ground, one clutching his arm where her knife had opened a shallow cut, the other trying to get his breath back. Callum was on his knees, blood streaming down his face, and Rourke stood 3 feet from her, his hands half raised, his eyes locked on the weapon aimed at his heart. "You won't shoot," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "You destroyed my family, took everything I had." Her hand was steady. "You think I won't end you?" For the first time, fear flickered across Rourke's face. The shelter hung in frozen silence. Nakoma kept the weapon steady on Rourke's chest while her mind calculated distances, angles, chances. She could end him, right now. One pull and the man who had destroyed her world would be gone. But killing him wouldn't bring her family back, wouldn't undo what had been done. And more importantly, it would tie her to him forever. His death would become part of her story, another weight she would carry through every remaining day. "Get on your horses," she said. "All 3 of you, ride north and don't come back." Rourke's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. We own this territory. We have papers, legal claim. You're squatting on property that belongs to... Your papers are worthless and you know it." Callum's voice was rough but steady. He had pulled himself to his feet, using the wall for support. "I've seen how you operate. Forgeries and bribes. One word to the territorial marshal and your whole operation collapses. You think anyone would believe a failed rancher and a savage?" The slur hung in the air like poison. Nakoma's finger moved closer to the trigger, but Callum spoke first. "Maybe not. But I kept records. Every transaction you made with my property, every signature, every witness who was paid to look the other way." His eyes were hard. They're with a lawyer in the eastern settlements. If I don't check in within the month, he takes them to the territorial office. It was a bluff. Had to be. But Rourke didn't know that. Nakoma watched doubt creep into his expression, watched him calculate whether the risk was worth the prize. You're lying, Rourke said, but there was no conviction in it. Am I? Callum took a step forward, then another. You want to find out? Want to bet your entire operation on the chance that I'm bluffing? The silence stretched. Rourke looked at the weapon in Nakoma's hands, at Callum's bloodied face, at his own men still on the ground nursing their wounds. The calculation played out across his features. Finally, he stepped back. Get up, he ordered his men. We're leaving. The two younger men scrambled to their feet and moved quickly toward the doorway. Rourke followed but stopped at the threshold. He looked back at Nakoma. This isn't over. Yes, she said quietly. It is. He held her gaze for another moment, then turned and walked out into the fading light. She heard them mount their horses, heard the hoofbeats fade slowly into the distance until there was nothing but wind and silence. Nakoma lowered the weapon. Her hands started shaking, delayed reaction setting in. She had broken her vow, had fought beside a man, had stood shoulder to shoulder with someone instead of alone, and somehow she was still standing. Callum moved closer. You saved me. Again. You saved me first. You lied about the records. Only half a lie. I do have records, just not with any lawyer. He smiled despite the blood on his face. Seemed like the right thing to say. She looked at him, this stubborn rancher who had collapsed in the desert and changed everything. His face was swelling where Rourke had hit him. His shirt was torn and stained with blood. He looked like he had been through hell and back, but his eyes were clear, and when he looked at her, he didn't see something broken or untouchable. He just saw her. What now? She asked. I still need to get to the settlement. Find work. He paused. But I could come back. If you wanted. Check on you. Make sure they don't return. The offer hung between them. He was giving her an out, a way to return to her isolation without completely closing the door. It was considerate, kind, everything he had been since the moment she had lifted him into her arms. But Nakoma realized something in that moment. She didn't want to go back, didn't want to rebuild the walls and live behind them alone. The vow had protected her, but it had also imprisoned her, and breaking it, terrifying as it had been, had set something free. Or, she said slowly, you could stay, help me reinforce this place, make it defensible if they come back. She took a breath, and after that, we could travel to the settlement together. Two people have better chances than one. Callum's expression shifted. Surprise, then understanding, then something deeper that made her chest tighten. You're sure? She thought about it, really thought about it. Thought about the years of isolation, the safety of distance, the control that came from never letting anyone close. Then she thought about the moment she had carried him through the desert, the way he had tried to protect her, the way fighting beside him had felt less like weakness and more like strength multiplied. No, she said honestly. I'm not sure, but I think that's the point. Being sure kept me alive, but it also kept me from living. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his skin, close enough that if she wanted to, she could reach out and touch him, not out of necessity, not to save a life, just because she chose to. Her hand lifted slowly. Her fingers touched his face, gentle against the bruises forming there. The contact sent a shock through her system, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something that felt like possibility. Stay, she said again. Not a question this time, a request, maybe even a hope. Callum's hand covered hers, holding it against his face. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll stay. The sun was setting beyond the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out to the gathering dusk, and for the first time in 8 years, Nakoma stood in the doorway of her shelter with another person beside her, and didn't feel the need to run. She had refused to touch any man, until the rancher collapsed into her arms, and in saving him she had discovered that some vows are meant to be broken, because the strongest protection isn't walls. It's choosing who you let pass them. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where survival and unexpected connections reshape everything in the harsh frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.